Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Erin, and my pronouns are she, her.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 7th Sunday after Pentecost, also known as Lectionary 15 or Proper 10, which this year falls on July 16th.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
For our deep dive into gardening this week, we are super excited to have special guest Erin Liu, who is professionally a nurse and most recently worked as director of nursing at a local boarding school. She and her husband have 2 kiddos, ages 3 years and 6 months, so currently works as education and activities director for these 2. Welcome, Erin.
We are so glad to have you with us.
It's great to be here, thanks.
It is good to have you, and I am super excited because you are my gardening expert, and so it is exciting to have you on and be our gardening expert on the podcast as well.
Well, I am definitely no expert, but definitely a hobby and happy to share and chat and nerd out with you guys.
Perfect. So, Erin, you have had some adventures and done a lot of learning about gardening, even if you don't consider yourself an expert. Can you tell us some about your journey to gardening?
Yeah, so starting probably post-college is when I first started really getting into gardening, and it had a lot to do with kind of where I was living at the time. When I was living in Maine, I had a couple of landlords who were really, really flexible about being able to start a garden and let me put in some raised beds. And so I was able to start gardening there. And I've been able to try a couple of different methods. Primarily it's been raised beds. I've done a little bit of container gardening. This year I'm trying something new. I'm trying some vertical gardening. So it's been a fun journey to try and fit gardening into kind of wherever I am at.
Yeah.
Great.
I think I'm more familiar with raised bed gardening, but I had not heard of vertical gardening until you sent me a picture of it. Can you just explain kind of what that is?
Yeah. So I have basically it's like picture a couple of giant pots stacked on top of each other. The bottom layer, and then you offset it, and there's a drip system in the middle that lets water drain from top to bottom. The one I have is 5 tiers, and each one has a little pocket that you can put a plant in. And so I can plant basically small containers that are stacked up on top of each other in order to grow more stuff in a smaller footprint.
Ah, okay. Cool.
So, I think I've mentioned this on previous podcast episodes, but while both of my parents are into gardening, I just did not inherit any of their skill or talent at all. And growing up, I guess I always kind of thought that there are flower gardeners and there are vegetable or like food gardeners, because my mom is into flowers and my dad, he loves gardening, but he wants something he can eat at the end of it, which I understand. And probably if I was good at gardening, I think I'd be on that side of things. So is there like a rivalry between flower and vegetable gardeners, or is this just something I made up a whole cloth because of my own family history?
You know, the most people that I know who enjoy gardening just get really excited when people want to put things in dirt.
That's fair.
So there might be a friendly rivalry, and I think there's a different mindset behind a flower gardener and a person who grows food or does more of a food garden. With flower gardening, you have to think about more aesthetics and how things are put together. And with vegetable gardening, you're thinking more about what do I like to eat and plant and what works well together. And if it's not the most aesthetically pleasing, that's okay. Yeah, I think most people who are into gardening, like I said, that I know, are just excited if people get excited about trying to put things in dirt. So like my 3-year-old loves to help me out in the garden. She recently has decided she's going to plant flies.
Okay.
Sure.
I mean, if she succeeds, let us know. Sure. Well, yeah, protein is good for you. Out of curiosity, do you have an opinion on the tomato being a fruit or a vegetable debate? That just seems like a very garden-centric thing, because tomatoes are often what people start with.
It's a very common first kind of foray into gardening. From a gardener's perspective, when you're planting vegetables, or at least for me, when I'm planting and picking different things to put in my garden, I'm not necessarily thinking about, oh, this is a fruit or this is a vegetable. I'm thinking, what part of plant am I eating? Or what is this plant for? Does it need depth for roots, or does it need space for leaves, or am I eating the fruit of the plant? And so it's more about parts of the plant, root, stem, leaves,
Sure.
flower, fruit, versus when you're cooking in the kitchen, you're thinking about things more from a dietary standpoint or things that work well together. And so don't necessarily put tomatoes in your favorite fruit salad. Some people do, but your favorite fruit salad. But when you're thinking about, oh, I might be making a pasta dish and I'm going to make spaghetti, and that you're thinking more vegetables, carrots, tomatoes. And so you're thinking about it more from a culinary standpoint and less from a growing standpoint.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That was a great way of like avoiding officially getting deep into the controversy while also giving a good response. Well played.
Very diplomatic. I feel like I should mention that I did actually just listen to a podcast a few days ago there were actually a series of lawsuits about tomato as fruit or vegetable, because it turns out that the laws for food safety and also shipping are different depending on what type of food it is. And so that was a episode of Things I Missed in History Class.
Yeah.
It was very interesting.
That sounds fascinating, actually, a little bit. Yeah.
The court's answer was basically yes, if I remember correctly. So.
Perfect. You get all the regulations of both types of food. Brilliant.
Yeah, they tried to balance it somehow, but
yeah. So you kind of maybe were getting at this a little bit in what you just said, but one of the things that I've learned from you in gardening is that some plants work better together than others. So like in terms of raised flower beds, like which ones need shade and which ones need full sun and providing shade for others, that sort of thing. And I know there's like a special trifecta that is known as the Three Sisters for a lot of Native communities, that is squash, beans, and corn that grow really well together. And I'm curious how you think about this when you're planning your garden, of like how the things work together and what you do to do that.
So there are lots of different things that you can consider. So in a lot of ways, I think it depends on what your gardening type preference is, whether it's rows or a garden bed that has plants combined together, or whether you're interspersing plants and companion planting. Those are all gonna have you think about it in different ways. So I really like companion planting. I've really liked trying square foot gardening at one point as well. But I think for me, it's companion planting. You're thinking about what the plant's specific nutrient requirements are, and then what do they replace in the soil for one piece of it. So in the trifecta, it's corn, beans, and squash, and it is a specific type of beans. So if that's something that you're interested in trying, make sure you're looking at what type of beans, because some beans actually deplete the soil more instead of put nutrients back into the soil. But typically, if you're doing like a common bean with your corn, that bean is going to actually replace nitrogen in the soil. And so it's going to amend your soil to help provide nutrients that the other plants need. And then your corn is actually providing the structure for your beans to grow on. And the squash is helping to do more of a ground cover. So you're reducing the amount of weeds that are going to be in your garden. And usually squash plants have big leaves, or a lot of squash plants have very big leaves. And so those leaves are going to help shade the ground and help keep moisture in the ground. And so when you're doing companion planting, you're thinking about some of those factors: what nutrients are being removed from the soil, what's being put back into the soil, how are they helping each other. And then there's also a pest control standpoint. So some plants will help deter garden pests.
And some are more effective than others.
And some are definitely more
effective. My dad planted marigolds for years, and the marigolds did absolutely nothing to keep the foxes away, or deer or something. They didn't really do a lot of good, but they were pretty.
Interesting. Yeah, I've heard marigolds are good, but I don't remember what for.
I know garlic is another one, just because it's got a stronger scent. It deters some plants. So garlic and onions, I think, help deter rabbits, I think.
Ooh, so
I don't
there's
know.
lots of reasons to grow garlic, and not just because I love garlic.
And vampires.
And vampires. That's fascinating.
Okay, so there are some plants and crops that, like, if you plant them in certain areas, they will take over the world, right? Like,
Yeah.
I've been warned in the Midwest, you're very careful about where you put your rhubarb. If you must grow rhubarb, and don't just steal it from your neighbors like normal people, be careful about where you put it, because, like, once we almost lost a shed to a thing of rhubarb. It tried to eat it. Or if you want to have mint in your garden, put it in a pot and make sure that the pot isn't on the ground. Put that pot on concrete. And in other parts of the country, there are also other plants that are like this. Is this something you have experience with?
I've always been really careful about what I put in my garden. And so
That probably helps.
I try and be very intentional about what I'm planting and where I'm planting it for those reasons. But I think some of the other things that you don't necessarily think about are things like strawberries. And it's not necessarily a bad thing, but we had some raised beds and we had to move one of our raised beds. And it happened to be the bed that we had planted strawberries in.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the dirt as we were moving the bed naturally fell onto the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And now, several years later, we are finding strawberry plants throughout the yard.
That is fantastic.
Excellent.
I love that. Yeah, I had heard of mint, and the congregation that I was most recently at had raised beds for a community garden, and I think one of the things was oregano. The oregano like kind of took over. We did not do a great job of maintaining the garden last year, and so I think that's probably a good part. And we didn't really have winter, so nothing died in the way that it usually does when like snow falls.
Sure.
So I am aware of those, but had not thought of strawberries. And I think like part of it though, right, is that anything, if given enough space and the right conditions, can grow and potentially get out of hand. Like I know people with raspberry bushes where they're like, we started with this bush and now it's huge. And like, yeah. But I love that there are just strawberry plants everywhere in your yard.
Now, we don't really get many of the strawberries because the birds and the bunnies and everything else tends to eat them, but
yes,
it's cool that we have them. And I did go and dig one up and put it in a pot this year, so we'll see what happens.
Nice. Yeah, my dad and my sibling have a cherry tree. They have a couple trees, and one of them is a cherry tree, and the birds always get it before they can. So they just like put this big net over it to like protect the cherries from the birds every year. But yeah.
So you also have to think about, so there are plants that have become invasive now because people have planted them as part of gardens, and now they are taking over. So like in Minnesota, in this area, buckthorn is a huge issue. And so it's taking over natural forest land and is actually smothering out some of the native plants, making it harder for them to grow. And so it's a challenge that I think is important that people consider when they're picking plants. And I really appreciate when people are very intentional about picking native plants and making sure that we're not introducing plants to the ecosystem that aren't really intended to be there, because we don't know what the outcome will be.
Yeah.
I have also been told that this is a family-friendly podcast. We don't use family-unfriendly language here, but if you do want to learn some new stuff, talk to a gardener from the American South about kudzu, and man, your language is going to get so much more creative so fast. I have seen what that stuff does. It's terrifying.
I have no idea what either of those plants are. So, can you describe those two plants just so like I have an idea, and all of our listeners who are as garden illiterate as me, like the buckroot and the kudzu?
Buckthorn is, I don't know really what it is that well. I think it's a viney plant, but I could look it up quick.
And it does have thorns.
Oh, okay.
I've been told that. The kudzu kind of looks mossy, and it tends to like grow on and sort of hang down from the branches of trees. And so it's very recognizable, but it tends to take up all the available resources. So
fascinating.
So to get ourselves back to gardening, Erin, why is crop diversity or growing different kinds of each plant or crop important?
So I kind of talked about this with the Three Sisters idea, in that you want to make sure that your soil isn't being depleted of nutrients. So one of the big reasons for doing like a crop rotation or growing a cover crop if you can't do either of those things, amending your soil is to make sure that the nutrients in the soil are there for your plants year after year. If you keep growing the same plant in the soil every year and you don't do anything to it, it's going to run out of the nutrients that your plants need to grow. By growing the same plants in the same soil year after year, you're also much more likely to have plants that get diseases and can succumb to those different plant diseases or challenges, different funguses, things like that, that live in the soil and then can thrive with the plants being the specific plant that they like being there.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know next week we're going to talk more about like agriculture and stuff, but I know like in the Midwest there's a rotation between corn and soybeans, and also a time of like letting the field be fallow, which is very biblical, that like every 7 years you don't plant crops and you just let the field grow what it's going to grow, and that's what you eat off of for that year and anything you've stored up. But yeah, so I think that's an interesting, like, okay, I see this in real life and the Bible. Yeah. So speaking of crop diversity, there are like a lot of different plants out there, and I know a lot of us, like at Synod assemblies for my like regional gathering when I was living in Minnesota, they actually like had a group that would come and table and just give out seeds for free for community gardens. And there's also like seed banks and heirloom varieties and GMOs and like all of these different things that like, it's not always clear to me what they are, but then also like what the importance is. Like, why is it important to know what you're using or to use a particular type? So can you just like help weed through that? See what I did?
I can try. So typically heirloom varieties are plants that have been open pollinated. Essentially that means there's no human intervention. They're grown out in the field or grown in your garden, and they are pollinated by whatever happens to be around. And those seeds are typically ones that you can trace back, I guess is the kind of language that I would use. Think like ancestral tracing. But for, I think it's 50 years. We might have to look that up and verify it. But I think it's 50 years. And again, it's been open pollinated. Those are typically the plants where you can save the seeds and regrow them the following year.
Nice.
A hybrid plant, which is normal seeds, the most common seeds, the ones that aren't labeled with anything special, are often seeds that have been grown in an environment that is specific to growing plants for seed. And so it's probably got 2 parent plants that my guess are heirloom, so that you're maintaining the qualities that you want, and then cross-pollinating those specific plants. And they're grown in that unique environment so that there's no additional introduction of other pollinators, is how I understand it.
So it makes sure that like your particular type of tomato isn't going to be an accidental cross-pollination with another type of tomato to create some other type of tomato.
That's my understanding of how hybrid plants work. And so that might be like somebody might be trying to do a hybrid tomato to withstand like blossom end rot or different diseases that tomatoes might face, or some plants, they grow them to be drought resistant or have a stronger root system. So it kind of depends on what qualities the seed producer wants in that tomato or wanted when these seeds were first created or first cross-pollinated. And then GMOs are typically plants that are grown by a major company and they are produced in a lab. And so there is a genetic modification to that plant for a specific purpose, and it is done in a lab. And from my understanding, most seeds that you can buy on your seed rack at the garden center are not GMO seeds. The GMO seeds are seeds that are typically produced for growth on a large scale production. So seeds that farmers would purchase, where they're planting fields and fields of crops, as opposed to the local, backyard garden that you might see driving down the street.
Okay.
Yeah. I'd also like to throw in a quick plug for the concept that GMOs are not necessarily evil and also not necessarily like bad for you health-wise. The dwarf wheat that was invented in, I think, the 60s saved uncountable lives in India and such, because they were able to create a wheat that was shorter and therefore didn't get completely destroyed every time there was a storm. And so it is a good thing. And of course, Star Trek fans will recognize that concept from the Trouble with Tribbles episode from the original series that involved the Quadriticale, which was a takeoff on the dwarf wheat. So I'm a big fan of that too.
Okay. Because I was going to say, I think one of the misconceptions that happens, particularly in this country, is that people think that pre-colonization, everything just naturally grew great and that humans have not influenced plant life. And the reality is that like there is a lot of like really intentional cultivation and care for plants by Native peoples throughout this land before colonization and since then. And so like certain like weeding and those sorts of certain things where like you're making sure that certain things are more able to grow and you're maybe getting rid of certain things, but also helping things cross-pollinate if that's what's needed, or like those sorts of things. That's a natural part of how humans have interacted with plants. There are different extents to which, like, and we'll get more into this next week, I think, with like when GMOs or when like big agricultural companies are doing things, what is changing and what can be problematic about that. But yeah, it is natural and like historical and traditional for humans to engage with plant life and help cultivate it to
For sure.
to bear good fruit.
And there are some plants where if you're not intentional about that, you may not get a good crop. So there are some plants, this gets into pollination, and my 3-year-old has been loving pollination this week. We've been talking lots about bees. But there are plants that can self-pollinate, and they have everything they need within that plant. There doesn't need to be a ton of additional intervention.
It's almost like if they were a person, we would call them intersex. Continue.
Interesting. Anyway, and then there are some plants where they have to use male flower and a female flower in terms of the pieces that need to be cross-pollinated. So they're not contained within the same flower. And so when you are thinking about the ability to grow fruit from those types of plants, if you don't have good pollinators in your area, you might need to go and help them pollinate. And so things like, I think zucchini, some of the squashes in particular, if the pollinators aren't active when the flowers are open, because those flowers are also only open during certain parts of the day, you won't get fruit on the vine because they haven't been pollinated. And so you might need to take a paintbrush and go, oh, I'm going to take pollen from over here and put it on this flower over there.
You get to be your own bee. That actually sounds delightful. I've also heard, like, particularly in the Midwest with corn, if you're trying to grow particular types of corn, especially like more native or heirloom corn, because there's so much corn that is grown not for consumption, that people will like put bags over the top so that they don't get cross-pollinated with the wrong type of corn, and then intentionally cross-pollinate, which is kind of like hybrid, but also kind of not. But yeah, I have heard that, so I could be wrong, but
Sure.
yeah.
I haven't tried growing corn, so I haven't really looked into it.
There you go. I had a roommate a couple of years ago who did, and so I don't think it was for edible corn, but it was also not for the like non-edible agriculture corn. It was like native corn.
Like decorative corn?
Yeah, that's the words. Yeah. Also, I just want to like, while we're on the topic of seeds and things, seed banks. So there are seed banks that exist, and this is what I know about them, and correct me if I'm wrong, but like part of the thing with seed banks is you can't actually like save seeds forever. So you need seeds to be used in order to continue to have seeds in like a seed bank. And there are seed banks all around the world, I think, to save species of plants and species of, I think, especially food plants, but like just plants in general that are in danger of becoming extinct, which is something we think about for animals, but not as much for plants. And so there are seed banks that like actually encourage you to buy and use their seeds so that it perpetuates and these plants continue to grow, which I think is like also a really cool thing and a complicated thing that I guess I want us to like lean more into, that of like things are meant to be used and seeds are meant to like continue to be planted and to grow and make more seeds.
Absolutely. And as an aside, but not an aside, my 3-year-old came across a box of seeds that I had from when I last had access to a big garden space. And so I had saved them thinking the following year we would plant more seeds. And then we ended up moving and I couldn't plant most of them. And so she found them and she's like, Mama, let's plant these. And most of them were probably from 2016, 2017. So probably, they're pretty old seeds. And most of them did not grow. So to the importance of, yes, use your seeds, use seeds. If you want to save seeds, get seeds that you can save, like heirloom varieties, and, go online, YouTube it, learn how to save them so that they can be used again the following year or maybe 2 if you store them correctly. But yes, if you don't use your seeds, you're not going to get plants.
Yeah, I have a few seeds like that. Oops.
So, focusing in a little more on the experience of ordinary home gardeners, what roles do wildlife play in a back garden, from insects to bunnies to deer?
So, there are lots of really, really great things that insects and things can do. There are also lots of things that are problematic. So, we need insects. They're pollinators. They help us grow better crops. They help things grow. They help make fruit. They make sure that we have seeds for future plants to grow. And also, they can be absolutely devastating.
Yep.
Last year, for example, my in-laws let my 3-year-old plant a garden in their backyard. But since we didn't live there, we were only there occasionally to take care of it. And it was completely eaten flat to the ground by bunnies or deer. I'm not sure which. And so we were not so successful with our garden just because nature happens and animals need food too. And here we gave them a lovely buffet.
Yeah.
I've had some challenges this year with my garden tower. When I first transplanted my tomato plants in there, a bunny got to my leaves, and so I've been trying to figure out, like, how do I naturally deter the bunnies? And so far, because I'm growing in a container, I was able to trim the really low hanging stuff, and they've left it mostly alone.
Oh, nice.
Now that some of my other plants are getting bigger and are starting to hang over the sides of my containers a little bit, I'm not so sure that the bunnies are going to stay away, so we'll have to see if those bunnies enjoy their buffet or if they leave it alone.
Yeah, that's interesting, because there are a lot of plants that do deter certain animals, insects, and like bigger animals, but like you mentioned, garlic and onions and stuff. But interesting.
The other challenge is, while we love pollinators, caterpillars are not always the friendliest to gardens. So while there are lots of things that I love to grow and that I would like to be able to grow, there are some things that I hate growing just because they always get eaten. And I can't seem to figure out what the right combination is to make sure that certain insects don't eat my plants.
Yeah. Are there particular plants that get eaten more frequently? Like, there are certain ones that you're talking about, right?
Oh, yeah. My least favorite to grow are brassicas because they always seem to get eaten. So particularly, like, I've tried to grow broccoli and I've tried to grow kale. And my 3-year-old this year got to kind of choose what we planted, and she really wanted to try growing broccoli. And all of my broccoli plants are completely covered in caterpillars. And
yeah, I always see caterpillars in CSA things with broccoli.
Yeah, the leaves are mostly gone.
That is a bummer. And a learning thing for the 3-year-old, but
absolutely.
Sure. Yeah, well, that is rough. Yeah. And we kind of talked about this a little bit, but there are lots of different ways to plant gardens, from like random, scattered, as we hear in the gospel reading for today, just scattering the seeds anywhere, on the road, in good soil, on the rocks, wherever, to raised beds, to square foot gardening, which you briefly mentioned. Can you tell us a little bit more about, like, comparing, like, the different ways to do it, I guess, to give people kind of a better idea of, like...
Yeah, so square foot gardening is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a way to grow more plants in a smaller footprint. At
Mm.
least from my understanding, that's the background behind it.
Okay.
Instead of having rows and rows and rows of plants that are really long and you're planting, your plant every so many inches or every so many feet, depending on what it needs,
Mm-hmm.
you're looking at, okay, if I have one type of plant, what's the spacing that plant needs? So, like a tomato
Mm-hmm.
plant needs a full square foot
Mm.
so that its roots have enough space, so that it has enough space to grow up. And then there are other plants that maybe don't need as much space. So carrots, your little seed packet tells you, plant this every so many inches.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're planting by that and you're looking at, okay, I should be planting this, I think it's every 2 inches,
Mm-hmm.
I think. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to plant a row of carrots that's 2 inches apart and then do another row that's a foot away and another,
Mm-hmm.
you know, row of carrots that's 2 inches apart. So what square foot gardening does is combines that and says, okay, here's a square foot,
Mm.
and I can plant carrots every 2 inches in both directions. So in one
Mm.
square foot, you get 16 carrots.
Ooh.
And so it's condensing the amount of space
Cool.
that your carrots are taking up
Mm.
and reducing the amount of space like between rows and things like that so that you can fit more plants in. I think typically what they recommend starting with is like a 4x4 garden bed. So
Okay.
4 feet wide, 3 feet long, and then being able to interplant within that bed based on the square foot grid,
Yeah.
and then using each square for a specific type of plant and planting it based on whatever its space requirements are.
Okay. So that would be particularly helpful for like those of us that maybe live in a city. And so like if we're going to have a garden and grow stuff, we're more likely to have a limited amount of space. So it's kind of like
Right.
bang for your buck, kind of like getting the most out of the space that we do have.
Yeah, that's definitely one way where you can get more in a smaller space so you're able to grow more, like you said, more bang for your buck.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that I've tried in the past has been doing companion planting paired with square foot gardening. And companion planting is really looking at what plants go well together, kind of like we talked about earlier, and are going to either provide something else that another plant needs or provide protection for another plant, use different nutrients in the soil or replenish nutrients that other plants need, but then trying to do that on a smaller scale. So thinking like, okay, square foot gardening style, my tomato plant needs 1 foot of space, but that doesn't mean that I can't necessarily plant something else around the base of it. I could try and plant like, oh, maybe I'm gonna plant carrots or radishes or something that's smaller, kind of near that plant so that I can use some of that ground space, help keep the weed cover down so I don't have to weed as often in my garden, and then also get more packed into a space.
Yeah. Okay. I think I remember when you all had the garden beds a few years ago, that was the kind of 1 foot square foot gardening of like the different plants, but then also like it provides if there are plants that need shade, right? Like the things that grow tall, like tomatoes frequently, can provide shade for the things that need to be at least partially shaded. And then on the other side can be like the sun that gets full direct sunlight and that sort of a thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I tried to do that a lot with growing things that are vining. And so tapping into a little bit into using the vertical space. And so there are things that naturally like to climb, like beans and peas and cucumbers. And so those, if we can trellis them and grow them up, then we can also plant things under the vining structure. So if we put them up on a trellis, you can grow things underneath there where it's more shaded to keep plants cooler and things that don't necessarily need direct sunlight.
Okay. Yeah. So that's interesting for like square foot and like companion plants and like how they combine or how you can team up with them. But there's also like other ways, like my yard has, technically we have like a place where we could plant stuff, but we don't actually have like the space, I don't think, for like a raised bed garden. So what other ways do people garden? Because like my dad just like has a garden, and so just like he has like a whole yard, and so there's like plenty of room and he just puts stuff where he wants. And then like less room, raised bed. But if you don't even have like that space for a raised bed, what kind of options do people have?
Yeah, so last year we were living in an apartment. All we had was a little tiny balcony. And so we were fortunate that my in-laws gave us the option to plant some things at their house, but we also chose to buy some small containers that we were able to plant. And so you can do container gardening. Essentially, really anything will work. You just want to make sure that you have the right depth and that it's a big enough space to grow whatever it is that you actually want to grow. But you can grow things in a 5-gallon bucket. So you want to make sure you have good dirt and good drainage and like the space you need to grow your thing.
Okay, so for good dirt, we mean probably like don't just like dig up the stuff on the side of the road.
Yeah. Yeah. Especially, well, one, because you don't know what kind of dirt it is. You don't know if it's got a lot of clay in it or rocks or things like that, or if it's extra
oil.
sandy or oil or, stuff like that for sure. But there's a mix of dirt that is really commonly used in square foot gardening called Mel's Mix, and it's a throwback to one of the people who really started kind of the trend of square foot gardening. But it is a mixture of compost, peat moss, or coconut coir, and vermiculite.
I don't know what half of those things are.
Yeah. So compost, obviously, most people know what compost is. Just degraded plant material, or organic material, decomposed plant material. And then, so coconut coir is like the fibery bits of a coconut, and it's to help with drainage in your soil. So it lightens up your soil a little bit and helps it drain better. And then vermiculite, I always get this mixed up with perlite. One of them is really great for retaining water, and one is really good for drainage. And I think vermiculite is good at holding water to help keep moisture in your soil so it doesn't dry out so quickly. And so you do equal parts of these 3 different things. And the compost in particular is really high in nutrients. And so then your plants are getting the things they need. You may, especially in containers, you may need to amend your soil with either more compost or looking at a fertilizer throughout the gardening season to make sure that your plants continue to have the nutrients they need. So that's one of the challenges with growing in containers is it's a limited nutrient supply, and your plants aren't able to pull water from anywhere in the ground. They have a limited space.
Yeah.
And so really looking into like what your plants are going to need and making sure you add those nutrients in periodically throughout the summer. Definitely don't go overboard with fertilizer. Less is always more. Follow the package directions.
Yeah.
And so that's a way that you can try to garden on even your balcony. And like I said, even if you have a 5-gallon bucket, you can put dirt in there and you can grow plants.
Yeah.
And then if you even want even more garden space and you are in that small backyard patio, you don't have a ton of space. This year we're trying a vertical garden tower. And so the footprint of the garden tower is probably 2 to 3 square feet. Like that's the amount of space it would take up at the bottom. But it's 5 tiers tall. And so I have the ability to plant, there are little pockets, 5-6 pockets in each tier. I don't remember. But I have roughly, 30 to 40 plants.
Wow.
Spaces that I can plant in. And so I'm able to grow vertically instead of just taking up ground space with a pot.
Interesting.
Sure.
I have a couple of grow bags, which are basically fancy pots that are like more like a bag, so I can move them around if I need to while the plants aren't hanging over the side. And I have some grow bags that are able to be moved around, and then they also are supposed to help prevent the roots of the plant from getting stuck in spirals. And so it's supposed to just be a better overall experience for the plants to grow in a container. So I have a few of those for my bigger plants, like my watermelon and my zucchini plants, and then all of my other plants are in this grow tower. So even my tomatoes I'm growing in the tower. I have tomatoes, broccoli, carrots, lettuce, cucumbers. I've got some, a couple of flowers thrown in there.
Cool.
It's definitely an experiment this year. This is not, I've never done vertical gardening like this before. So we'll see how it goes. Yeah. So far, it's going pretty well.
Yeah. You sent me a picture several weeks ago, I think, now, of the tower. And I was like, whoa. But our house is, particularly one person in our house, is doing basically what will amount to container gardening, but we're like starting from seedlings. And so like it's been really fascinating to like figure out how best to do it, because a lot of the dirt, like we bought a thing of compost, and then when we were trying to like get it wet and water this stuff to start it was like so hard because it was so dry to get it wet. And so like I remember one afternoon I spent literally hours just like pouring the water, because we were repotting from seedlings, because she had gotten this like really cool like mini greenhouse thing for the seedlings to like have the humidity and all of that stuff. So we were repotting, and so then I remember like having all of that dry dirt and just like pouring the water in, and as it like dripped out, holding that over a different pot and then pouring from the tray of water back into that and then putting it on, and just like continuing to not run the water through completely, but continuing to recycle the water so all the nutrients didn't just like drain out of it, until we got it so that the soil was like more mud-like and could absorb the water. But like that was like a whole thing now. And then of course the plants immediately, we finally got like thunderstorms that we hadn't gotten all spring, and so then the plants got like beat up by that, and it was a whole thing. But yeah, we're in the like container mode, but I hadn't thought about like needing to replenish the nutrients later in the growing season, so that'll be a good thing to remember.
Yeah,
for sure.
So you've mentioned a couple times your 3-year-old in particular, but you have kids, and I know from my own experience, I know how you are approaching like exploration and learning as like a full part of life, and like that's part of play, that's part of everything. So how are you involving your kids in gardening, in addition to the 3-year-old picking out a bunch of broccoli to grow?
Yeah, so I have a 3-year-old and a 6-month-old, and yeah, part of my parenting philosophy is very much hands-on learning and kind of involving my kids in everything as they're able to and as their ability level allows. And so for my 3-year-old this year, that meant that she helped with every step of the process. She helped by picking out what seeds she wanted to plant, and we started everything from seed this year. So it was a good learning experience, talking about, here's a seed, and we're going to do these things to it, and it's going to grow into this plant, and here are the different parts of the plant, and then this is the part that we can eat and use. And so the first thing we did was radishes, just because they're simple and easy to grow, and they can be harvested quickly. So radishes are typically, the radish varieties that we chose were all harvested in less than 30 days.
Wow.
And so you can plant your seed, and then in about 30 days, they should be ready to harvest. And so we started those inside in a big box, essentially, that had enough depth that the radishes could grow.
But they don't even need that much depth. Like, they're not carrots.
But they don't
so they don't, yeah.
Yeah. We had about, I think the depth was roughly 6 or 7 inches of soil. And so that's all we really needed. And like I said, she did the whole process. She picked out the seeds. She helped me mix the soil and fill her pots with soil. And then we talked about, this is how deep you need to plant these seeds. And so she used her finger and tried to poke it in that far, covered them up with dirt, kept them watered. She was responsible for, helping make sure that they got watered every day, or however frequently they needed once they started to sprout.
Did she remember, or did she need prompting?
No, she definitely needed prompting. Some days she was really good about it. Like the first thing in the morning, she would wake up and be like, I want to go water my plants. But there were definitely days where she had forgotten all day, and it was like, hey, it's almost time for bed, we gotta go check on your plants.
Yeah.
And then when they were ready, she got to harvest them and pick the radishes and see and taste the fruit or the root of her labor. And so she was really excited about that. She did not like them, but she was very excited to try them the first time.
That's fair. Radishes are a particular flavor that, like, there are different ways to incorporate into. Yeah, that's awesome.
But so that was in spring when it was still cold and we weren't ready to put plants in the ground yet or in our tower or containers yet. And so we were growing inside. So we had grow lights set up so that the plants would get enough sunlight and all those things. But now that our garden is outside, she helped me transplant some of our seedlings into our garden tower and plant seeds into the different tiers of the garden tower so that we could grow lettuce and carrots and some of the things that you have to start from seed. And then she also, it was like a little mini raised bed that we had on our balcony last year. It's got about I don't know, 10 inches of dirt or soil in it. And I basically just gave that to her and said, okay, here's your box of dirt. Do what you want with it. And so we have some flowers that she planted, and she found some strawberries in the yard, and she decided to plant those, which won't grow, but that's okay. It's a good lesson in that, like, not everything will grow, and you have to save seeds a certain way in order for them to grow. And she took some of the old seeds that I had from
Forever ago,
2016
yeah.
or 2017 and threw those in there. So we'll see if any of that comes up. Hasn't so far.
The flies.
And the flies also went in that
Very
garden.
important.
She was very excited about planting flies. I'm not really sure why.
Because of who she is and her creativity. I can totally see it. Like, yeah.
But mostly she just really loves playing in the dirt. And so she has this box of dirt that even though she has seeds in it, she'll still go and dig in it, which is the other reason I'm not really sure that anything is going to grow.
It's hard to grow when you keep getting disturbed and traumatized by 3-year-old hands. Yeah.
Curious 3-year-old shenanigans. And then my 6-month-old, he is not obviously of an age where he can do a lot of those things yet, especially without things going directly into his mouth. And so a lot of what we're doing for him is more of a sensory experience and talking about, this is a plant and these are its leaves, and he will feel the leaves and often pull them off the plant, which is okay. But, and we showed him a tomato and he squished the tomato and then he had tomato all over his hands. But that is also okay.
Yeah.
And it's involving them in whatever way is right for their age. And if that means getting a little or a lot messy, then that's what happens. And that's okay. And for our family, that's what works. And so that's kind of the route that we're taking.
Yeah. I think it's particularly like and then he pulled off the leaf and that's okay. And then he squished the tomato and that's okay. And I think there's an aspect to gardening in general that's like, it will not work exactly the way that you want it to. Like, there will always be something that happens because gardening is not completely in our control. And there's a variety of different scripture that backs that up, and today's gospel kind of gets at that. But I think it's a great practice for those of us, myself included, who like control and like to like plan and have all the things to be like, okay, this is going to be what it is going to be. And to like for the 6-month-old to be like, okay, if I have really important, I don't want to ruin them plants, we're gonna like look at the other plants so that it's okay when he grabs the leaf and pulls the leaf off or squishes the tomato or that sort of a thing. But to be able to balance that out of like, if there are things that are important, because growing food for your own family is a sustainable practice, and that is for many people a matter of health or life and death, like, right, like in a global sense, like being able to provide your own food helps keep families alive and okay. And also you want to have some space that you are intentionally cultivating that with your kids. Otherwise it's not going to necessarily be passed on, and a love for that or a valuing of that is not necessarily going to be passed on. So it seems like it's a little bit of a dance.
Absolutely. And, we are very fortunate and privileged to have the ability to grow food that if it doesn't work, it's okay. We're going to be okay. It's not like we're not going to have food to eat. Whereas for a lot of people in the world, that isn't necessarily the case. And so they might have to take those different practices to safeguard the food that they are cultivating and not have their kids be quite so hands-on. And that's okay too. And that you have to do what works for your family and your situation.
And there are ways to like, even with a 3-year-old, be like, okay, we're going to just look and be gentle and not touch. And as they get better at things, then you're like, okay, we can say what we're going to plant or whatever, but we're also like going to leave it really open. So yeah.
Sure.
So you mentioned that brassica is your least favorite thing to grow, primarily because it just gets eaten by non-humans.
Yeah.
But what are your favorite things to grow?
So to start off, I like to grow things that we're definitely going to use. So things like carrots and tomatoes and peas and beans, zucchini, cucumbers, those are all things that we're going to use. We use a lot of those in our household. And so growing food that we actually are going to eat and use, as opposed to something that we're going to grow and then people are going to be like, I have this thing and I don't really want it. What do I do with it?
Yeah, that makes sense.
But I think one of my favorite things to grow is probably things on vines. So I really like growing like beans and cucumbers and peas, and I think some of those are my favorites because it's almost like a scavenger hunt when you have to go and find them.
Yep.
And so it's kind of fun. It's like, where's the next one? Of course, it's also a little frustrating when you then miss some.
And
But
then
again,
you come back
like,
and they're like, this pig.
but especially with growing food with kids, being able to like peek under the leaves and be like, look, we found a whatever thing you happen to find. And then they get really excited and then you get really excited because they're so excited. It just adds to the fun of growing stuff in a garden.
Yeah, there is a 5-year-old. I don't know if it is still the case, but I think when she was like 2 or 3, she didn't like snap peas, but she ate snap peas with me because we had gone and picked them in the garden and then like eaten them. And it started out and she would just eat the inside things and then I would just eat her like the shells. And then because I was just like eating them, then she started to try them. And then like other people would try and give her snap peas and she wouldn't eat them, but she would always eat them with me. And so, but those things were like when kids actually go apple picking, those are two things of like taking the things off of the plants and like seeing where they come from is just like makes it more cool, I think, more engaging.
Sure.
For sure.
So what about winter? Is that just a break for you, or do you also have stuff to do during winter?
So winter months typically in the past have been either more of a downtime with gardening for me or thinking and planning about, what went well, what didn't go well, what do I want to try in a change for next year? Do I want to try something new next year? And what's the best way to try and do that? But I also really want to try extending the growing season. And obviously living in the Midwest, winters are bitter cold sometimes. And the amount of sunlight you get isn't necessarily conducive to all the plants and what they like and what they want in terms of amount of sunlight. And so either growing in greenhouses with grow lights or doing things outside where they don't need as much sunlight. So crops that typically are more shade loving plants. It's always something that I've wanted to try, either using like a row cover, basically like you do hoops and then do like a plastic sheeting over your raised bed to make like a mini greenhouse kind of a thing, or doing a cold frame or something where I can try and extend the growing season is on my to-do list for at some point in the future.
Nice.
Sure. My dad actually built a greenhouse onto the side of his house after taking a course at a community college for how to do that. And one of the tricks that he learned in that class was if you store water in large quantities in your greenhouse that's attached to the side of your house, it will help the space in the greenhouse not freeze. He's currently up to 130 gallons. He needs to get up to 170 gallons, I think, for the size of his greenhouse in order to actually have that work. So he just saves his gallon water containers, the jugs, and whatever other containers come into the house and fills them up with water and then sticks them on the lower shelves of the greenhouse so that they're in there and out of his way. And he's planning on getting a couple of larger like buckets worth of water too. But that's been really helpful, and he only had his greenhouse freeze 2 nights this year, and so he's hoping that next year he will be able to like have stuff in there year round. It'll still have to be cold weather stuff, but
yeah, that it can be in.
That's awesome.
That's awesome.
Thermal mass is so important. Like doing, anything that's going to really capture and hold the heat from the sun. So water is a great one. I think cinder blocks and things like that can also be a source that can help hold that heat as well. Is a great way to capture that sun's energy and help use it to keep your greenhouse warm.
And for like carrots actually like get sweet after a freeze. And so I think so often for those of us who are maybe less familiar with gardening, it's like once it snows, we're all done. Once there's a freeze, we're all done. But like there's a lot of plants that can continue to grow and actually like might benefit from a freeze, like carrots. Yeah.
Yes. And things like garlic you can plant in the fall to winter over, and then in spring they'll start to grow.
Yeah, because
after they've been in the ground for that freeze, because it's more of a bulb. Yeah. And, doing things like mulching over the top to help kind of keep the heat in the soil a little bit more and the moisture in the soil also helps some of those cold weather plants.
And
do better.
Like you said, mulch, which I experience as like a thing that you buy, but also like I know people who put leaves down when they like rake their leaves.
Yeah, the idea of mulch for me is less about like this physical thing that you buy. It could be leaves, it could be, like the thing that you buy could be straw. Some of the things you want to consider when you are mulching your garden is what plants are you putting in and what are you putting on top of them, because as they break down, organic material, obviously it's going to break down over time, but it can require certain nutrients to be pulled from the soil in order for it to break down over time. And so thinking about that in terms of what you're putting down as mulch is also important, as well as is it likely to carry a bacteria or fungal disease that might harm your plants. They're all things to just keep in mind as you are deciding what and how you're going to do different things in your garden.
Yeah. So speaking of that, this has been filled with great like tips and advice for gardening, but do you have any other like specific tips or advice for people in terms of gardening?
I think my biggest one is just if it's something that you're interested in, just pick something and try it. Even if it's a tiny pot and you just start with a flower, or start with a carrot, a thing of carrots, or like I did with my 3-year-old, we picked out radishes. None of us really eat radishes in our household, but they're really fun to grow and it gets her excited about growing other stuff. And so by introducing that and having it be a short turnaround time from planting the seed to growing the actual thing that you can harvest and eat, gets her excited about going down to check on them every day and seeing how they've grown and how they've changed, and then finally getting to pull it out of the garden and eat it. And so just getting started, just picking something.
Yeah. And I think I will add to that, the first time I grew anything in like a real meaningful way, my first thing was basil, because I love basil and I love pesto. And I didn't grow it from seed. I bought at a local like farmer's market from a farmer. I bought like already sprouted basil plant. And that's a great way if you're not sure about like planting and seeds and like those complexities, to be able to buy something that has already been sprouted for you. And then it's more maintenance as you like get to know the plant and what it needs and those sorts of things.
Absolutely. And as you're starting out too, just like you said, you loved basil, and so you picked something that you love, and so it's going to be more meaningful for you to grow basil and to be able to use that basil.
Yeah, wonderful. So now for our most cultivated segment, let's make a Muppets musical. So usually, Erin, we invite our guests and we cast the Muppets in either a token human or Muppets if we were taking one of the readings and making it into a Muppets musical. So if you have ideas about that, that's great. Otherwise, one of the possibilities for this particular episode is if you were gardening, which Muppets would you want to help in the garden or want to not help in the garden?
The Muppets that currently come to mind for me, my kiddos have been really into Winnie the Pooh in the past few weeks. And so Rabbit, because Rabbit loves to garden, yes. I would love to have as a helper in my garden. I would also love to invite Eeyore to come and garden with me, because I find gardening to be very calming and relaxing, and I always feel better after gardening. And I don't know if it would work for Eeyore, but it might. And so, maybe a little cheerful boost for Eeyore if Eeyore could come and garden with me.
That's fantastic.
Absolutely.
And I love that.
Yes.
I think Eeyore would probably enjoy gardening, and Rabbit is a great choice. Also, I just saw on Twitter, Elmo, since we've started this segment, my social media has become much more heavily Muppety, Sesame Streety than it was before. So Elmo apparently just tweeted, I think it was yesterday, that even though Elmo doesn't have any green thumbs, Elmo's red thumbs are ready to garden. So I think Elmo would be probably similar to your 3-year-old, because Elmo's also 3, and excited about gardening and trying things and experimenting, and yeah.
Well, and I think any of the Sesame Street Muppets would be great, just for that sole reason, is that they're all children.
Yeah.
And getting children out in the garden, even Oscar.
Mm-hmm. Oscar would be
I was kind of surprised Emily didn't bring up Oscar, because I was thinking that that's, of course, where the compost comes from.
I was going to say Oscar would be great for compost. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think Snuffleupagus would have great fun digging the holes for the garden with his trunk.
Okay, I can see that.
So, Erin, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
Nope.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Great. We just like to check.
Yep. It has been so wonderful having you on the podcast and for this episode in particular. I always love learning and learning gardening in particular from you and hearing what you're up to with your new gardening experiments and adventures. So thank you for being on.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
So, our first reading for this episode is from Isaiah chapter 55, verses 10 through 13. Isaiah tells the people that the word of God will be like snow and rain, bringing growth and joy and peace, and accomplishing what it sets out to do.
So, one of the themes for this passage is the idea of just the majesty in nature, the descriptiveness that Isaiah uses to describe how majestic nature is. And whenever I think of things that really capture the majesty and beauty of nature, I think of this person I worked at camp with whose name is Jesse Kroc, and he is an artist, and he does these amazing paintings of aspens. In particular, all of his paintings I love. Someday I will own myself a Jesse Kroc art piece, but in particular, the way he paints the aspens, and there's this image he has of being under just a grove of aspens in the fall, and all of them are pointing towards the sky, and you get the yellow leaves and the blue sky peeking through, and it's just so majestic and so beautiful. I absolutely love it. Yeah,
they sound wonderful.
It's fantastic. And then in verse 10 we read, "For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven and do not return there until they have watered the earth, making it bring forth and sprout, giving seed to the sower and bread to the eater." And I was struck by this because, as our listeners know, I grew up in Vail, Colorado, and one of the effects of climate change is that the season of snow, which we call winter, has gotten later. So it used to be that I grew up with white Halloweens, Halloween costumes fit over snowsuits, all of that stuff. And now it's hard to get enough snow to open the mountains for skiing before the final week of November for that vacation time. And apparently one of the ways that they manage that is if it's cold enough, they can make snow. If it's not cold enough, they can't. And did you know you can seed clouds?
Oh, sure.
So they
Well, you can seed clouds for rain. I didn't know you could seed clouds for snow.
Yeah, in the wintertime. So you go and you however get this stuff that's basically they call it seeding, right? But it's stuff that makes it so that the clouds...
I think it's basically salt, isn't it?
Quite possibly. I mean, realistically, snow and rain is just it comes on to different molecules and falls. And also, rain starts out as snow. So you can seed snow because everything you're seeding is snow first. And then it turns into rain as the temperature decreases as it gets closer to the ground. But yeah, so they have started doing that where they will seed clouds to make it snow on the mountains so that they can open the mountains so that people can come, so that our economy can function, because capitalism and climate change.
Yeah. Pretty much. Yeah. And then in verse 12 we read, "For you shall go out in joy and be led back in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall burst into song, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands." On the one hand, this sounds very happy and wonderful. On the other hand, I have to say this sounds like a nightmare for night owls, right? I'm imagining that because this is an agricultural society, this is happening in the morning because that's when you go out into nature, into the world, right? And the idea of this happening and having to do it without coffee and in an agricultural society, that means you're going out early in the morning, this is dawn. I can't imagine how I would feel about it. I would not necessarily be happy if I hadn't had my coffee yet. And especially for creatures or people who are more of night owls, I'm thinking of the Fae folks in the October Day books by Shauna McGuire. They are almost entirely nighttime people completely. And so I think that would basically be just absolute murder on their mood, and I don't think they'd like it at all. So, like, again, when we think about things, let's be inclusive and remember that people are different.
Well, and maybe that is exactly it, that like some go out and enjoy in the morning and some go out and enjoy in the evening.
Absolutely.
Also, just as a quick side note, this verse was one of the theme verses for when I worked at camp for our backpacking program, and the initial shirts that they got had a typo. And so every time I hear this verse, I read it, and the last part I always read as, "And all the trees of the field shall clasp their hands," because that was the typo. And so that's always like where my mind goes for this verse.
Nice.
Every time. I love it. Yeah. And then our second reading for this episode is Romans chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. Paul explains that what God couldn't do for us through the law, because we allowed our worst impulses to taint our interpretation and application of it, God did instead through Jesus Christ. So I used to think that Romans was like the best of Paul's writings, and lately I'm like, Paul, really? Like, the number of times he talked about the flesh. And then I was like, well, according to some ghosts, humans are just flesh sack, or you could call those flesh pots. So much flesh. Fleshiness.
Well, this is the lead up to Romans chapter 8, which is the, like, heart and soul of Lutheran theology, and you do have to talk about sin before you can talk about grace. But I would also say that your comment about flesh sacks and flesh pots made me think of a vertical gardening option available in The Sims 4, which I have never managed to actually do myself, but I have seen other people do, which they have a vertical garden option that you can basically put against a wall in Sims 4, sort of as a decoration, and then you can tell it what plant do you want to grow in there. Mm-hmm. But then if you do certain special things that I'm not entirely clear on, you can also have it turn into a meat garden, and you grow meat. It's not actually meat, it's actually like plant meat, substitute meat. But it looks kind of weird, and that's immediately what I thought of when I combined your comments about the fleshiness of this passage and also our deep dive about gardening.
Well, and interestingly enough, I just saw an article about growing flesh, and they have figured out how to grow basically animal meat from a petri dish instead of on animals.
Yes.
Which I think is fascinating, and the person that shared it is Jewish, and so the perspective that I got in the sharing of it was, so what does this mean?
It would be kosher
for dietary things, but would it be kosher? Because part of how something is defined as kosher or halal in particular is how it is killed. And so if it is an animal and it is animal meat but was not killed, how does it factor in? And so it's like, that would be...
I'm sure they'll have to talk about that for a while.
Yeah, that would be a fascinating conversation though, I think.
Oh yeah.
I'd have fun with it. And then in verse 5, we read, "For those who live according to the flesh set their minds on the things of the flesh. But those who live according to the Spirit set their minds on the things of the Spirit." And this is where, okay, I'm giving Paul grief for talking about flesh, and I will continue to do that. But in particular, I'm doing that because it has different implications today. Like, when we talk about flesh, then there's, a lot of sexism and misogyny that goes into, denigrating women in particular and lifting up men as, rational. And what Paul is really talking more about is this self-interest and putting yourself above others and self-centeredness versus a care for other people, a charity or communal care. And so when we talk about flesh versus spirit, it's not the body-soul dualism that is super problematic. It's these concepts of connection to something larger than yourself, not versus only caring about yourself. So.
Sure. And then in verse 7, we read, "For this reason the mind that is set on the flesh is hostile to God. It does not submit to God's law. Indeed, it cannot." And I think I've talked about this before on the podcast, but from my point of view, this sounds true. This is accurate. We have bodies that are wired to survive. And if our bodies go into survival mode, that is what we are focusing on. And so when that happens, we can't focus on God or what God wants from us or who God wants us to be, because when our physical needs get in the way, it can be almost impossible to focus on any of that. And it reminds me very much of the Snickers bar commercials of people being hangry and then, actually eating a Snickers does not always fix it in real life, but in the commercials it does. And you sort of turn into a different person. And now I would love to expand on that. I'm not really a zombie person in terms of genre and stuff, but I think Snickers could probably have like a whole line of zombie commercials of people getting angry and turning into zombies, and that would be an interesting illustration of this.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. That would make sense.
I could also see how that might, scare some people and probably not actually work out well for Snickers in the long run, but it's an idea.
Details.
Yeah.
I just thought they could say that they could have a tagline of better than brains.
Yes, but that's not actually a very high bar.
Details.
Well, give you prion disease. Yeah. So our gospel reading for today is from Matthew chapter 13, verses 1 through 9 and 18 through 23. Jesus tells the parable of the generous sower, explaining that the word of God has different effects depending on the circumstances of the people who it comes to.
So one of the things that happens in this passage is there is a pretty clear narrative bias or interpretation. And this happens most of the time when Jesus tells a parable and then there's a later explanation. That is usually the author of the gospel inserting that explanation as a way of fitting their agenda, which is not exactly a bad thing, but is something to be aware of because we attribute all of the words attributed to Jesus. And the reality is that there's been a significant amount of editing, and each of the Gospels is written to a particular community for particular reasons. And so Matthew is writing to a community who is mostly Jewish, and it is a community that is trying out this new way of being and living and listening to new words. And so the idea of the seeds being planted and affirming that they are good soil is really helpful and is a life-giving thing for the initial Matthean community.
Yeah. And as we jump into the verses, in verse 9 we read, Jesus says, "Let anyone with ears listen." And going back to that whole people are in different circumstances when they run across the word of God. What about those who don't have ears, Jesus? Jesus is going to have to come back and do some serious expanding on things when we make first contact with aliens, because aliens are not necessarily going to have ears, right?
And there are some humans.
Yeah, probably. Mm-hmm. So, and I'm not even just talking about people who are deaf. There are probably going to be aliens who don't use the sound waves the way that we do in order to communicate. And so we're going to need the Gospel 2.0 for how do we reach out to people who are not like us.
Or
in new ways.
Dolphins and orcas.
Right.
They communicate. They don't have ears. They're very smart. They're sinking million.
I did actually also listen to a podcast episode about exactly how smart or not smart dolphins might or might not be recently, if we want to throw that onto the list of things that we're linking to. But
interesting, because the orcas are proving themselves pretty smart lately. And it's complicated and we're, anthropomorphizing animals, blah, blah, blah. But still, I think animals are way smarter than we give them credit for. So I'm here for it.
Absolutely. Sure.
And then in verse 19, we read, "When anyone hears the word of the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what is sown in the heart. This is what was sown on the path." And this is Jesus' explanation of the seeds sown on the path that come and are eaten by birds. And all I could think of when I read this was in the Divergent books when Triss is exploring her fears, and in her fear landscape, she is attacked by crows. And so I was just this is Triss's fear landscape, which is actually about powerlessness. But the fear of birds, and can you imagine being all eaten up by birds and birds just starting to peck at you and so I was yeah, that's not what I want to be. I don't want to be on the road. Yeah. So thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for the 8th Sunday after Pentecost. This podcast has been produced by us, Emily Ewing and Kay Rohloff. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdstatchurch. It's cheaper than actually putting in the work of a quality garden, because while you can just buy a packet of seeds at your local grocery store for $1, or it's probably $2 now, in order to, have the trowel and the tools and the soil supplements and the gardening gloves and all the rest, you will need to invest some actual money.
It's true. It's also cheaper than not gardening and buying all your vegetables and produce from the store.
Probably, yes.
Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets musical for this episode, whether it is who you want to or don't want to garden with, or if you have a casting for one of the passages we talked about.
Yeah. As the ancient Christians said,
Pax vobiscum.